I don't know about you, but when I am working on a sermon or working on a speech or working on a presentation, I like to kind of really get into the meat of the presentation, really get into the meat of what I've been studying. And I found a little historical tidbit about New Year's. And it fascinated me, and I have to share that. How many of you knew that New Year's Day is one of the oldest public celebrations in our human history? Did you know that? It started in Roman times with the advent of the Julian calendar. And it was designated as a feast day of the Roman god Janus. That January is named after. And Janus was known as the god of gateways and new beginnings. And we didn't put any kind of religious context on New Year's until after Jesus' birth and death, when at the creation of the Gregorian calendar, the first day of the year became the feast of the naming and circumcision of Jesus, which is something that many Anglicans and Lutherans still follow liturgically today. I thought that was kind of fascinating because it sets the stage for us in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a very beautiful passage. It was one of the very first ones that I ever learned as a child in Sunday school. And it's most noted for being read at memorial services and funerals. But it's also a very appropriate scripture passage for us on New Year's because it talks about beginnings and endings. It talks about a time. Everything is an appropriate time. There's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted. And the interesting thing is when you go back and you read John Wesley's commentary on this text from 1700, very little has changed today, because when we look at the words, everything under heaven means that it was everything is part of a cycle. It's part of life. And it was life that was created by God for humankind. And everything that happens, God is a part of. And so when we are looking at a new year, we are asking God to be with us as we leave the old behind and go forward into the new. And we don't care about what happened in the past. What we care about is what's going to happen in the future. And that's what we really care about on New Year's. So when Kate's talking about making resolutions, I'm having a hard time talking today. Resolutions, how many people, keep a resolution? Not very many of us. I've made tons in the past, and I can be honest, I haven't got very far. I usually make it to March, maybe April, and then what I have planned just goes out the window. But it's also not just about making resolutions, but it's a time of reflection. And that's the other part that very few of us think about theologically with New Year's. It's a time of reflection. Because as we're making those resolutions, as we're looking at what we want to do in the future, we need to be reflecting on what that means to our life. What does it mean to go forward into the future? What do we want our life to look like? What do I want to look like as I live that life and change into the future? And I think that perhaps that's why this Gospel of Matthew is chosen as a companion piece with Ecclesiastes in Scripture. Now, I know the language in that Scripture passage can be off-putting. You know, that separation of sheep, goats, and being thrown into the fire. That's not the way we talk anymore. That's not what we look at. And according to Dr. Ray Stedman and the United Methodist Church, covered in the Master's Dust website and blog, what they're talking about is the fact that Jesus was connecting with the people of the time. That's the way the people saw things. And Jesus is expressing his urgency. That people look at this in a very urgent way. And when they're talking about, there's three different perspectives on this that go towards one common goal. One group of theologians believes that they're talking about the nations being judged. Israel, the nation of Israel, and nations that support Israel are the sheep. And the nations that don't support Israel are the goats. And so what they're talking about is how one group of people treats Israel. Now, the second school of thought is that they're looking at the nations, the sheep, being the messengers of God, the disciples. And they're looking at how the Gentiles, in an increasingly Gentile church, are treating the messengers of God. The third understanding, which is a more modern understanding, is that it's about all of the nations and how they're following the teachings in the Gospels. What are the Gospels saying, and how are they living into that? And that raises questions for us. Because what do we want to be? Do we want to be sheep or goats? Do we want to be known as people who followed Christ, who supported the Gospels, who lived according to the Gospels? Or do we want to be people who turned our backs, who didn't provide food? And all of these thoughts about food and shelter and visiting are right out of rabbinic tradition. That's what the rabbis taught in the earliest Jewish churches, is to care for others. And what they're talking about in this particular passage is about showing grace to one another. Because that's the real heart of the matter of sharing, of providing comfort, of providing clothing. Showing grace to one another. So how do we show grace to one another? I'm going to ask you a few questions. Not to answer these, but I just want you to think about it. How do you show grace, for instance, to a neighbor who comes over gloating about their winner, their candidate, winning the election? And they're going to talk about how things are going to be different with this candidate. There was a thing on Facebook this week about a woman, a Hispanic woman that's in a Walmart store. And this lady, she's speaking Spanish to her sister. And they're in line to return or purchase some clothing. And this lady just starts screaming at them about how President-elect Trump is going to change all that, and why don't they speak English? Because that's the language in our country. And it made its rounds on Facebook with hundreds of thousands of hits. How do you show grace to someone? Because even though that person is being hateful, they're still God's beloved child. How do you speak truth to power without becoming the kind of person who resorts to the very same language and the very same behavior of the person that you're frustrated with, that's in power that shouldn't be? How do you show grace to that person? How do you show grace to a family member or a neighbor or a friend who works in maybe a mining industry or works in some other industry that is felt to be damaging the environment, and you want to protect the environment? How do you show grace to that family member that you deeply love, but don't understand what their attachment, and yet you're seeing their anger and their frustration and their pain because they can't take care of their family? Where do we find grace, and how do we show grace? And what does Jesus teach us about grace? They're all through the Gospels. We've heard them. Turn the other cheek. If someone charges you with carrying their pack a mile, you carry it too. Don't judge. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's how we show grace to one another. We follow what we're taught. And if we believe in following grace, and we believe that God is with us in all things, and we're feeling frightened with the new year or something, where do we find God in the midst of our uncertainty? We have to trust that God is with us through good times and bad times. The bright new beginnings that we are seeking aren't about making resolutions or going to the gym or getting on the Atkins diet or any of that. That's not the new beginning that we're talking about. The new beginning that we're looking at going into the new year is our opportunity to change the world. Because we're called to live in faith, not in fear, but in faith. So how do we do that? Do we want to be sheep? Do we want to be goats? And so, as you go out into the world, think about beginnings. Think about endings. Because one person at a time, if we show grace, as we're called to show grace. And granted, we can talk about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. And that's a physical charge that we're tasked with, but we're also tasked with showing grace to one another, showing love, showing compassion. We do that one person at a time. And if we do that, that's our bright new beginning. We have an opportunity to change the world, to make it the place that we want to live in. And in words attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, I've always liked these words: be the change you seek. And by showing grace to one another, that's how we do that. So, sheep or goats, we have a choice. And I'll leave that up to you to wrestle with. But in closing, I just want to say, have a blessed and happy